Hi everyone! Welcome to the fourth part of the history of the Latin alphabet. Today we're going to talk about the early types. If you think about your experience as a little kid, maybe with Play-Doh or with cookie dough, like pressing things in the soft dough or clay, that's probably what it was like to make this Fidos disc. It's from a long time ago, obviously, but they were clearly using seals or stamps of some kind to press these shapes into the soft clay. And if you think about how things have progressed since then, like letter punches and coins and woodblock printing even, those are the precursors that make people think about the invention of movable type later on. And there's some records of movable type before Gutenberg invents his in the 15th century. So a lot of the earlier movable type is mentioned in China in the form of ceramic, wood, and also metal. And for the oldest surviving book, though, using metal movable type, it's Jigji, which is preserved in the National Library of France. It was printed in 1377, so it was actually a very long time, almost 8 decades before Gutenberg's invention of his movable press in Europe. But we have to consider that, perhaps these are very separate developments. Perhaps some of the precursors were already there, but some geographical regions started making their movable type faster than some other places. It's a little bit unclear if Gutenberg actually knew of these inventions that were happening in the East, but we can only speculate. Gutenberg was a goldsmith, so since his background was in carving metal pieces, it's perhaps a logical leap to sort of go from engraving, making pieces in gold to engraving letters in metal. And we've seen this slide multiple times before, but something that's remarkable is that since he was the very, very first printer in Europe, there were no standardized process for how to make books. So he needed to make a lot of things from scratch. So he's credited with inventions such as the process for making movable type, obviously, and also using things like oil-based ink. And using a wooden printing press contraption to actually press these into the paper. And a lot of people only collect books that are from the early period of printing because they're considered to be more expressive. Since this is before standardization takes place, which we'll talk about later on. And so we see a lot of different styles of printing, such as Johann Camp's Bible here. It uses a fracture style of type. Let's talk about the early German types. In Germany, Schwabacher was a very, very popular style of type. This evolved from textura under the influence of humanist type design in Italy, so you can see that compared to textura, things are a lot more open. They were influenced by rotunda, although it does possess very Gothic qualities. If you see the O, you can see that there's definitely a very straight pen logic going on in there, especially on the left side. And you can see that it's a little bit more compressed than what rotunda looks like. Schwabacher typesetting was the most common typeface used in Germany until it was replaced by fracture from the mid-16th century onwards. And you can see a lot of really, really beautiful Schwabacher specimens throughout history. And you can see that it was based on handwriting, much more than textura was. And here is the slide on fracture again. Now, this was written by Leonhard Wagner in 1507, and this is the first known specimen of fracture. We talked a little bit about how, the birth of fracture being associated with the German emperor back then, who commissioned a prayer book from the printer Anton Schwensberger. And here you see Schwensberger's type here on the right-hand side. And if you compare it to the original handwritten specimen here on the left side, we can see that it's actually very remarkably similar. Now, the funny thing is that this has some similarities to textura in the sense that it's very dense, and it has similarities to Bastarda, the Gothic cursive hands of the time, and it also has a lot of similarities to Schwabacher. So there's a lot of cross-pollination going on in between writing and type design. And the interesting thing about Fracter is that in the earlier times of, right past its invention, it's more common in the form of typefaces rather than writing. We go now into the early Italian types. Venice was a very, very important place in the efforts to transfer handwriting to type, because in the earlier efforts, it was a lot about how to emulate handwriting, calligraphy, to type. And you'll see a lot of non-Italians in here because Venice was such like a center for every printer and designers to be in. So you can see a lot of different nationalities gathering here. So Nicholas Jensen is a name that you might have heard of. Jensen's typefaces have been revived by so many different type designers over the years. And he's a very famous figure in Venice. Right here we see his specimen from 1471. Now, later, we'll talk about William Morris, but he's a very important figure, and he has a quote where he says, Jensen has carried the development of Roman types as far as it can go. And we can really see how beautiful his type design is. We'll also talk a little bit about the typeface classification system. Over time, we've needed a different way to identify pieces of type and to classify them into different design styles. And so, this is called humanist, in the sense that it has a lot of the human hand in it. And we can see the telltale signs of the humanist types with the sloped E. So if you look at the E, you can see one in the third line after Porto qua rationing. That E is sloped if you see the crossbar. Jensen didn't just make Roman types, though. He also made other styles, including this beautiful rotunda typeface here. Or maybe that's Schrabacher, actually. But we can see a lot of different styles that are happening. Ratdolt was another contemporary of Jensen's and also a very, very talented printer. He was a German printer, but then again, Venice was where he was at the time. Ratdolt is also known for the earliest known type specimen to date. He printed this broadside here where he was advertising the variety of fonts that he had in his printing house. And if you see the full page on the left side, you can see that there's a lot of different sizes going on here. Now, we have to remember that type back then wasn't resizable in the sense that we can do easily with our computer programs these days. So this guy had to cut every single piece of type in different sizes. And so in a way, it was a little bit more advanced in the fact that they were optimizing designs for different sizes. Maybe it was due to the physicality of the object as well. So somebody had to sit there with loops, magnifying glasses over their eyes, really trying to carve these pieces of metal and metal with hands. And if you can imagine, type, trying to engrave a little piece of type in 6 points would have been a very different experience compared to trying to engrave this as a 100-point type, for instance. And here we see a zoomed-in version where we see just the variety of typefaces here. So we can see Greek on the lower right corner as well. Aldus Manutius is a big name in the history of type design. He's one of the most famous early Italian printers, and we can see this specimen here that was carved by Griffo. We can't forget Francesco Griffo, because when we think about Aldus Manutius, we're thinking about the types that he cut. He's the designer and the punch cutter, and his capitals, you can see on the very top row here, they're modeled on Roman inscriptional sources. And we talked a little bit about in the Renaissance how everyone was inspired by the classic Roman inscriptions. Now, there's a quote from Donald Anderson's book where while Jensen and Ratdolt was the most talented of their time, Griffo had the most famous employer. So Griffo was a lot more well-known in their own lifetime because he just had an employer that sold books all over Europe. After some time, Griffo's type actually gets known as the Alden styles, or Aldine, perhaps. And if you see ever references to the Aldine editions, it refers to the books that was from Aldus Manutius's press. And here we can see that the type of the E, if you see like maybe on the third row here, per predio, the crossbar of the E is now flat. So now we approach the era where we classify typefaces as old style, where it still has a lot of the humanist aspects of it, but now we're getting into a little bit more modernized styles of design. And if you remember San Vito from our part 1 lecture, I think it was a part 1 and part 2, they based their first italic types on San Vito's handwriting. This is the first known specimen of italic type ever being used. So here we see that it's trying to emulate this notion of a handwritten book here. And so 1500 is when the first italic types emerge. And later on, Aldus Manutius and Griffo produce Virgil, a book that's pretty small in size compared to what they were printing at the time. And here we see italic being used. And it's speculated that perhaps that italic was better to have smaller sizes of type and to compress the type into smaller footprints of the page, so like they could produce smaller books. And a funny little tangent here is that like there's a modern day book called Mr. Penumbra's 24-Hour Bookstore that is a typographical thriller. And without wanting to spoil the book too much for you, this book is about a guy in San Francisco, like super techie. He was working in startups, and then he like starts working in a bookstore, and he finds out about this bibliophile cult. And a lot of the plot revolves around a coded book that was printed by Aldus Manutius and Griffo. Griffo has like a different last name, but it's clearly inspired by Francisco Griffo. And it sort of amuses me to think about like this like Illuminati cult made out of book printers. So if you want to get a good laugh and maybe hear some familiar names, that might be a good pandemic read for you, or any read. And so we go back to this Righi name. You'll remember Righi from the Writing Master era, where he was writing the first italic writing manual for people. And he printed a number of books, and he also designed type, funny enough. And here we see his type specimen, where he's using a lot of ligatures, meaning that there were designs where there was 2 or more letters joined together, and they would have had to be cut as a separate piece of type. So maybe like if you see here, there's an ST ligature on the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th line. And this ST ligature would have been a separate piece of type, because back in that day, you can't really put together pieces of metal type close together. Like you have a separate S and a separate T, you can't put it that close together enough to touch, because these are metal physical objects that we're talking about here. Now, like it said that like his first attempt wasn't that great, but like later on, like he started collaborating with a guy named Rotelli, and that vastly improved his letterform design. And here we go into France. Of course, just the same with calligraphy, we're also talking about efforts to import the national handwriting styles into type. And so we see Bonhomme's like Letter Bâtard, where he was trying to bring in the French Gothic style of calligraphy into type. And I also want to mention his daughter, Yolande Bonhomme, sorry French folks, because she's a very, very rare woman printer. You can see her printer's mark over here, where it's 2 unicorns on the shield on the left side, and I think that's very fitting for her, because in 16th century Paris, a woman did not choose to become a printer. So for her to have learned the craft of printing, she needed to be the daughter of a printer or the wife of a printer, and she was both those things. And in order to own a print shop, she had to just be one thing, a widow of a printer. And so, like, she was one. She was all of the above. And I think that's very, very remarkable for a woman of that time. Robert Grandjean is another name that you might have heard of, just because Robert Grandjean's type gets revived every few years, I think, by some aspiring type designer. And for students is a very, very inspiring model as well. And you can see civilité here, where he's also famous for. This is also another attempt to make French calligraphy into type design. And this invention is said to have such an impact on the king that he just gave him an exclusive privilege to use this type for 10 years, which is pretty astounding. Again, like all these creative folks knowing the king is sort of amazing to think about. And here's Garamond, the big name that we know because there's just been so many different revivals of Garamonds. If you remember Garamond, ITC Garamond being used by Apple computers in the early aughts, it's just such a well-known name in the world of type. And we'll see a lot of repetitions in terms of names here because a lot of designers are referring to who was before them. And so we'll see a lot of names being repeated in this lecture and the lectures after this one. Now, he designed his types based on griffos. So remember Aldus Manutius and Griffo a few slides back? So Garamond is inspired by griffos. And it actually is so successful that it replaces Griffo's original Roman types at the Alden press during his lifetime. And we can see that there aren't that many mentions of his italic types in history because Garamond's italic types weren't considered as impressive as his Romans. But it should be noted that he was one of the early printers to establish that italic capital should slope, just as the lowercase does. Now, these are the little things that get incorporated into our history. We just take it for granted that if we just click the sloped I italic button in whatever Word document that we're using, everything slants. But in Garamond's time, it wasn't very common to do that. The capitals would have been upright. Now we can see that he is using old style typeface designs over here with the very straight bar of the E. Now, old style typefaces are also called Gerald after Garamond as well. He's also very known for his Greek typefaces. Garamond came to prominence around 1540 when he made these Greek typefaces for a royally ordered book series. Now, this is now known as the Brextu Roy. I put the name in the slides. And this was based on the handwriting of the king's librarian back then. And so to emulate the notion of handwriting, he had to cut so many ligatures. So we can see a lot of the types having a lot of joins and a lot of flexibility just to emulate that sense of handwriting here. And it's very, very beautiful. If you remember the slide from Garamond, this is the same piece of paper, just a little bit lower in the same specimen. And here we see Garamond's type on the left side and Grandjean's type on the right side. So when you think about Garamond and a lot of the modern iterations, the italic is often based on Grandjean's italic type. And Grandjean also moved to Rome in his later days, where he worked on types for the Catholic missionaries. So to spread the word of God, he had to print books in different scripts and different languages. So he cut types for Armenian, Cyrillic, and Arabic, amongst others. We can't leave out the early Dutch types. You might have heard of Christopher Plantin. There's a famous Plantin typeface that is named after him. Plantin was a famous French Renaissance book printer who worked out of Antwerp. So we see a lot of Europeans moving in here and there, so their nationalities don't always match up with where they were active at that time. Van der Kier is less heard of, but he was the exclusive font supplier to the famous printer. So if you think about Christopher Plantin's books, you might be also thinking about Van der Kier's type. He also cut a very, very beautiful civilité here. I'm personally interested in a lot of the Gothic cursive types because it just looks so fluent in the way that they're written, and just a personal fascination with Gothic types as well. Another early type specimen just worth mentioning is the Leiden F. Druxel, which was made for the state sale of William Silvis's um, I guess like estate sale that was made after his death. Now, to advertise all the fonts that he had, the whoever was organizing the estate sale had a broadside printed with all his types, and you can see that there's a lot of very, very beautiful work here. And these pieces were only preserved because there was some like note scribbling that happened behind it. And he was considered to be one of the best printers in Plantin's day, and perhaps like the second best printer after Plantin. So it's a little bit sad to realize that there was an estate sale with all of his types being printed and, locked up and being sold off to the auctioneers. The early English types. William Caslon is another name that you might have heard of. He was Britain's first and most celebrated type founder. We have to note that before William Caslon, the British depended on Dutch typefaces to print a lot of their books. And Caslon's typeface arrived on the scene and was very, very popular because it established the British value in terms of aesthetics. Now, the funny thing in history is that Caslon's types were used for the United States Declaration of Independence. So it sort of just like makes me giggle a little bit to think about the irony of a British typeface being used to, declare the independence of the U.S. And modern Roman types. It's said that the movement towards modern typefaces began with the Roman du Roi, which means the King's Roman. It refers to the Sun King, Louis XIV, who commissioned this typeface. This was another attempt to sort of standardize type by having a grid and using compasses and rulers, and it was literally designed by a committee. This wasn't the most beautiful typeface, but it's sort of influential in the fact that it was different from Garamond's typeface. It was very different from what was originally there before this was made. And this is said to have been influenced by a lot of the type designers that came after this was made. Now, Fournier created a standardized measuring system for type. So when we think about, I set this in 12 points, like 13 points, like that comes from Fournier. This was later reworked by Francois Didot. So like it did go through some revisions after his initial invention of it. But it still is pretty remarkable thinking that like it came all the way from the 18th century. Baskerville is also well known because there has been a lot of revivals named after him. Mrs. Eves, that's very, very popular, was also modeled on Baskerville. So this famous English printer is known for partially redesigning the Roman and Italic faces that came before him. And when we think about transitional typefaces, we usually think about Baskerville. So it's a little bit more contrasty. There's a little bit more thinner elements in letters, and the serifs are a little bit less angular, but they're still a little bit rounded. And Bodoni is where things get very, very high contrast. Bodoni was an Italian typographer, type designer, and printer, and Bodoni's work is often presented alongside Didot's. The Didots, in particular, were a very famous printing family in France. And the Didots were famous as designers for like 100 years. So when we think about the Didots, we might be thinking about a family's worth of work as opposed to one person or a couple of people's work. The Bodoni and the Didots were rivals in a sense, but as I just said, the Didots were a family of printers that were famous for a century, pretty much. This is from Firmin and Pierre Didot's Louvre editions, which was made because they had a studio space in the Louvre Museum. And it's said that Firmin was inspired by Baskerville's typeface, and he just took them to the extreme. Like, he took Baskerville's forms and then made them, like, super contrasty. And here we see a stereotype, where it refers to the metal printing plate that was used for printing. So before stereotyping, printers used to lock up individual little pieces of type and have to print from that. So you can imagine how labor intensive it was to reprint an edition, because they would have to go back, reset the type, and then print it. So when stereotypes were invented, now like there was an entire metal chunk that was of the entire page. Now Didot didn't invent the stereotypes, but he did invent that word, and he printed a lot of very very cheap books using this process. And I think at some point he was appointed by Napoleon as to be the director of the French government's like national type foundry. That comes to the end of this edition, and just a reminder that all these lecture slides are available on my website. And here's the bibliography if you want to check out a lot of these. The graphic design history blog is very, very interesting. All right, thank you. I will see you in part 5.